Edmund Hartwell raised his glass and pointed at his own daughter, like she was a coat he'd grown tired of wearing. "Take her," he said, grinning at the ragged stranger on his doorstep. "Nobody here wants her anyway." The room laughed. Every single person in that drawing room laughed. Eliza didn't move, didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago how to turn herself to stone when the cruelty came from the people who were supposed to love her. But the stranger didn't laugh. He looked at her, just looked, and in his eyes she saw the one thing nobody in that room had ever offered her. Shame on her behalf. If this story moves something in you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels. The laughter hadn't died yet when Eliza turned and walked out of the room. Not running. She didn't run. Running would have given them something else to laugh about. And she had learned 11 years old, the first time her father had used her as a punchline at the dinner party, that you never gave people more ammunition than they already had. She walked back straight, chin level, eyes forward. She went to the front hallway, and she opened the front door herself, because Thomas the butler was still standing in the drawing room doorway enjoying the joke with everyone else, and she looked at the man on the step soaking wet, coat hanging off him like something the rain had beaten into submission, and she said, "Come inside." He blinked, just once, like the invitation was the last thing he'd expected. "Miss, you're soaking wet, and it's 40 degrees, she said. "Come inside." She took him to the small sitting room off the front hall. Not the drawing room she would have walked through fire before she brought him back into that room, but the old one, her grandfather's room, with the cracked leather chair and the bookshelf, full of books nobody had opened in 30 years. She lit the fire herself. She didn't wait for a servant. He stood in the doorway, dripping onto the stone floor, the canvas bag hanging from one hand. "Sit down," she said, kneeling to coax the fire. "I don't want to ruin the chair has survived worse." She looked up at him. "Sit down, please." He sat. She got the fire going and stood and looked at him properly for the first time. Up close he was worse than she'd thought. The coat was mended at both elbows, the boots cracked through at the toe, his hands rough and reddened from the cold. But his face was steady, not embarrassed, not grateful in that cringing way that made her uncomfortable, just steady. Tired, maybe, but steady. She went to the door and called for Thomas. Thomas appeared with the particular expression he reserved for situations he considered beneath the dignity of the household, which, in his estimation, included most situations. "Tea," she said, "and towels and whatever's left from dinner." "Miss Hartwell, your father, my father," she said pleasantly, "is asleep in his chair." "Tea, please, Thomas." Thomas looked at the man in the chair. The man in the chair looked back at him with absolutely nothing on his face. Thomas made the calculation he always made, weighed his dignity against her quiet immovability, and went. She poured the tea herself when it came. Handed it to him without ceremony. He took it with both hands, and she saw the way his fingers tightened around the warmth of it, involuntary, helpless, the way a person does when they've been cold for longer than they've admitted to themselves. "Eat," she said, nodding at the plate Thomas had brought. "Cold roast bread, a wedge of cheese. Don't wait to be asked again." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She sat in the chair across from him. "I want to. There's a difference." He looked at her. That look again, direct, measuring, like he was trying to figure out what angle she was working from, and coming up empty. "I'm Eliza Hartwell," she said. "I know," he said. Then after a beat, "Julian." Just the one name she noticed. She didn't push. "You came about land business," she said. "I did, at 9 o'clock at night, in the rain." The rain wasn't part of the plan. What was part of the plan? He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it was there underneath. She could see it. "Arriving before dark," he said, asking some questions. "Leaving? What kind of questions?" "The kind that need answers before decisions get made." She studied him. "You're not a solicitor." "No, but you have legal standing of some kind." "Or you believe you do." Something shifted in his face. Subtle, but she caught it. "What makes you say that?" "Because a man without legal standing doesn't walk up to a manor house in the rain and ask to speak to the owner," she said. "He writes a letter. He goes through a solicitor. He asks someone to intercede." You came yourself. That means you either have authority or you believe you have it. She paused. Which is it? He was quiet for a moment. Both, he said. She nodded. Like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. You can speak with my father in the morning. He'll be sober by 7, or close enough. She stood. In the meantime, Miss Hartwell. She stopped. He was looking up at her, and for the first time the steadiness had something underneath it, something she couldn't entirely name but recognized, the way you recognize weather before it arrives. What your father said tonight, he said. In there. She went very still. Don't, she said quietly. I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it. I'm asking you to, I know. He held her gaze. I'm sorry it happened. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. Outside, the rain hammered the windows. It happens, she said finally. Her voice was level. Professional, almost. The voice of someone who has filed a thing away so many times the filing has become automatic. That doesn't make it acceptable. No, she said. It doesn't. She picked up the empty tea tray. I'll have Thomas show you where you can sleep. The room off the kitchen is clean and warm. I'll make sure breakfast is at 7. She was almost to the door. Why, he said. She turned. Why what? Why are you doing this? He gestured at the fire, the food, the general fact of her presence in the room. I'm a stranger who showed up at your door. Your father just made you the butt of a joke in front of 30 people. Most women in your position would have gone upstairs and cried. Instead, he stopped, seemed to decide something. Why? Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Because you're a person, she said. And you were cold and no one else was going to open the door. She paused. Is that enough of a reason? He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he'd spent years trying to translate. Yes, he said quietly, that's enough. She found out about his feet by accident. She was coming back from the linen closet with the extra blankets she'd promised Thomas she'd bring herself, because Thomas, left to his own devices, would bring the thinnest ones and consider his duty discharged, and she passed the sitting room door and heard it. A sharp intake of breath, controlled, the kind a person makes when they're trying not to make any sound at all. She pushed the door open. Julian had removed his right boot and was sitting very still, jaw tight, looking at his heel with the expression of a man calculating damage. She didn't ask permission. She set the blankets on the chair, went to her grandmother's cabinet in the corner, the one nobody else in the family even remembered was there, and came back with clean rags, and the tin of salve she kept stocked because life in a country house meant there was always someone who needed it. I don't need, he started. I can see that you do, she said, and knelt on the cold stone floor in her second-best dress and didn't think twice about it. His heel was raw, blistered badly, the kind of wound that comes from too many miles in boots that had been resoled one too many times. She cleaned it carefully, efficiently, the way she did everything, and he was very still while she worked. The fire crackled. The house had gone quiet around them. Somewhere down the hall, someone was moving through the kitchen, but softly, the way servants move late at night when they believe themselves unwatched. You do this often, he said finally. Tend to strangers. I do this whenever it needs doing, she said, applying the salve with 2 fingers. Hold still. I am holding still. You flinched. That's because it stopped. Hurts? She said, not looking up. Yes, it does. That's what happens when you walk 20 miles in wet boots. She wrapped the heel with a clean cloth, neat and tight. How far did you actually come? A pause. Far enough. That's the second time you've said that. It's consistently true. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was looking down at her, and the firelight was catching the lines of his face in a way that made him look older than she'd first thought, or maybe not older, maybe just more worn. The way things get worn when they've been used hard and put away wet too many times. It'll feel better in the morning, she said. Don't put that boot back on tonight. Yes, ma'am, he said. She looked at him sharply. There was something in his voice, not mockery, not quite. Something drier than that. Quieter, you're making fun of me, she said. I'm agreeing with you, he said. There's a difference. She almost smiled. She caught it before it arrived. She stood, brushed off her skirt, picked up the dirty rags. Good night, Mr. Julian, she said. Just Julian, he said. "Good night, Julian." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Miss Hartwell." She stopped, turned. He was sitting with his hands loosely clasped, looking at her with that look, the one she couldn't read all the way through, the one that felt like being looked at by someone who was actually paying attention. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the food or the fire or the room." A pause. For opening the door, she held his gaze for a moment. "You're welcome," she said. And she meant it differently than he'd said it, or maybe she meant it exactly the same way, she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure about a lot of things tonight. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain and tried to think about sensible things. The school lesson she had planned for Thursday, the letter she owed Mrs. Pemberton, the winter stores that needed checking before December arrived. She did not think about a pair of gray-green eyes that had watched her kneel on a stone floor without a flicker of condescension. She did not think about the way he'd said thank you, like the words were something he didn't spend lightly. She thought about her father. "Take my eldest daughter. Nobody here seems to want her anyway." She had stood there while 30 people laughed, and she had done what she always did, gone still, gone smooth, given them nothing, and it had worked the way it always worked, the way a locked door works. It keeps things in as much as it keeps things out. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "Stop," she told herself. "It happened, it's over, it doesn't matter." But it did matter. That was the thing she could never quite extinguish, the small, stubborn, inconvenient fact that it mattered. That she was 24 years old, and she still sat at her father's table and flinched at his jokes, and wore her second-best dress, because her mother had borrowed her best one and never given it back, and some part of her, some small, persistent, embarrassing part of her, still hoped that one day they would look at her and see something worth keeping. She was still lying there, staring at the ceiling, when she heard her father's voice in the hallway below. Not angry, worse than angry, jovial. Edmund Hartwell was jovial at midnight, which meant he had woken up from his after-dinner doze and found company somewhere and was now performing for it. And performance from Edmund always meant someone else was going to pay for the entertainment. She got up. She heard them before she reached the bottom of the stairs. Her father, holding a candle, standing in the hallway outside the sitting room. And beside him Lord Ashby, red-faced, wineglass still in hand, apparently retrieved from somewhere in the house. And in the doorway of the sitting room, very still, Julian. "There he is," her father was saying, with that particular expansive warmth he used when he wanted people to understand he was the most generous man in the room. "Our guest, Julian." He said the name like a joke he hadn't delivered the punchline of yet. "Tell me, Julian, how are you finding Hampshire? Damp enough for you?" Lord Ashby laughed. He always laughed at Edmund's jokes. It was, as far as Eliza could tell, the primary function he served. Julian said nothing. "My daughter been looking after you?" Edmund continued, jerking his head in Eliza's direction without looking at her. She had reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped there, one hand on the newel post. "She's useful that way. Nursemaid sort. Can't say she's much good for anything else. No head for society. No particular gift for conversation. Can't play piano worth a damn." "Father," her voice was quiet, steady. Edmund turned. Saw her. His smile didn't waver. If anything, it widened. "Eliza, still up? Couldn't sleep? Neither could you, apparently. Come to check on your charity case." He gestured toward Julian with his wineglass. "Tender heart, my eldest, always dragging home strays. Dogs, schoolchildren, vagrants." The last word landed with a particular relish. "No offense, friend, none taken," Julian said. His voice was even. Dangerously even. Eliza thought the flatness of it, the absolute absence of reaction, like a surface so still you couldn't tell how deep the water was. "Father," Eliza said again, quietly, but with something underneath it now, something that was done being quiet. "It's late, Lord Ashby. I believe your carriage was called an hour ago." Lord Ashby blinked at her, looked at Edmund, made a complicated calculation. "Right," he said, retreating. "Right, yes, Edmund, good evening." "Splendid night." He was gone before he finished the sentence. Edmund looked at his daughter. Something moved in his face, a flicker of the thing that was always there, just under the performance. Not cruelty exactly. Cruelty would have been easier. It was indifference, the specific crushing indifference of a man who has looked at his child so many times and seen so little of value that he's stopped really looking. "Don't embarrass yourself," he said, not loudly, almost kindly. "He's no one, Eliza. Go to bed." He walked away down the hall, candle swaying. The silence he left behind was very loud. Eliza stood at the bottom of the stairs with her hand on the newel post and breathed through it the familiar specific weight of it. The way it always settled somewhere behind her sternum like a stone that had been dropped at there. So many times it had worn a groove. "Miss Hartwell," she turned. Julian was standing in the doorway of the sitting room. He had not moved during the whole exchange. He had been watching, she realized that now, not passively but carefully. The way a person watches when they are paying attention and filing things away. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "I know," he said. "I was going to say." He stopped, seemed to choose his words with the care of someone who doesn't waste them. "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Intervene." She looked at him. He would have kept going. "Yes," Julian said. He would have a pause. "Does he always?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was in the way she didn't answer. Julian was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with something she recognized. Finally, not pity, which she couldn't have borne, but something closer to understanding. The specific understanding of someone who knows what it is to be reduced. "The land business," she said suddenly. "It's serious, isn't it?" "Whatever brought you here?" He held her gaze. "Yes." "And my father is part of it." She nodded slowly. She didn't ask what it was. She wasn't sure she was ready to know, not tonight, not with the weight of the evening still sitting on her chest like something she hadn't yet found room for. "Get some sleep," she said. 7 o'clock breakfast. "And then you can deal with my father." She paused. "He'll be different in the morning. He's always different when he hasn't got an audience." "Better?" Julian asked. She considered it honestly. "Just different," she said. She went upstairs. Julian stood in the doorway of the sitting room and listened to her footsteps on the stairs, and when they faded, he went back to the chair by the fire and sat down and looked at the wall. He had been in a great many houses. He had sat across from a great many people who did not know who he was, and he had watched how they behaved when they believed nobody important was watching. He had seen generosity performed and cruelty dressed as humor and indifference masquerading as propriety. He had not expected this. He had not expected a woman who opened a door nobody else was going to open, and knelt on a cold floor without being asked, and stood at the bottom of a staircase in the middle of the night, and ended her father's entertainment with 4 quiet words. He had not expected someone who said because you're a person like it was the simplest and most sufficient reason in the world. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and pressed his hands together, and thought about what he was going to have to say tomorrow morning. His name, his title, the extent of what that meant for this house, these lands, this family. He had intended to tell her tonight. He had meant to, in the sitting room, before the food and the fire, and the way she'd looked at him over the rim of that terrible practical kindness and made it impossible. Tomorrow, he thought, first thing, before this gets any more complicated than it already is. He looked at the fire. She was kind when nobody was watching. Of everything he had seen tonight, the performance in the drawing room, the hollow laughter, Edmund Hartwell's particular brand of casual cruelty, that was the thing he could not set down. She was kind when nobody was watching. In his experience, that was the rarest thing in the world. The fire burned low. Somewhere outside, the rain finally stopped. And in the quiet that followed, in the old house, settling into the small hours of the morning, something had already begun, the kind of thing that starts before you notice it. The way water finds a crack in stone, patient, certain, and impossible to take back. The morning came cold and gray, the kind that settles into old houses and refuses to leave. Eliza was up before 6, she always was. Not because anyone expected it, nobody in Hartwell Manor expected anything from her except absence, but because the early hours were the only hours that belonged entirely to herself. Before her mother's instructions found her, before her father's moods set the temperature of the house. before the whole machinery of the family's social ambition started grinding again, and she had to find her place in it, which was always the same place, useful, quiet, and easy to overlook. She dressed without a maid. She'd stopped asking for one years ago. She went down to the kitchen, where Mrs. Poole the cook was already at the range, and she asked for breakfast to be laid in the back sitting room at 7, and Mrs. Poole looked at her the way she always looked at her, with the particular warmth of someone who understood, without ever saying so, exactly what kind of house this was, and exactly what kind of person Eliza was inside it. "The gentleman's still here then," Mrs. Poole said. "Not a question. He is," Eliza said. "Thomas says he doesn't like the look of him." Thomas doesn't like the look of anyone who arrives after dark without a calling card. Thomas isn't wrong about most things. Thomas, Eliza said, taking an apple from the bowl on the counter, is wrong about this one. She went to check on the room before 7. He was already awake. She could hear him moving before she reached the door, not restless movement, not pacing, but the deliberate, quiet sound of someone who wakes early and doesn't waste the time. She knocked anyway. "Come in," he said. He was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, fully dressed except for the one boot, which he was looking at with the pragmatic expression of a man deciding whether a thing can be salvaged or needs to be discarded. "How's the foot?" she asked. "Better." He looked up. "You were right about the boot." "I usually am," she said. "About practical things." She came in, left the door open the width that propriety required, and crouched to look at his heel without asking. He let her. The blister had sealed overnight. The salve had done what it was supposed to do. "You can walk on it," she said. "Not today." "I only need to get to the drawing room," he said. "My father will come to you," she said, standing. "I'll make sure of it." "You don't need to walk anywhere." He looked at her. "You're going to arrange a meeting with your father on my behalf." "Yes," without knowing what the meeting is about. "Yes." "Why?" She looked back at him steadily. "Because you came a long way in bad weather for something that matters, and whatever it is, it deserves to be taken seriously." "My father doesn't take things seriously unless someone makes him." She paused. "I'm good at making him." Julian was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but a version of it. The version that happens when you've revised your expectations of a situation, and the revision keeps turning out to be insufficient. "Breakfast first," she said. "Then my father. Come when you're ready." She left before he could say thank you again. She had the feeling that if he said it once more, she was going to do something embarrassing, like believe it. Edmund Hartwell appeared in the back sitting room at 7:15, which was earlier than Eliza had expected, and suggested that someone, Thomas, almost certainly had told him something that made him decide promptness was in his interest. He came in straightening his cuffs, which meant he was performing composure, which meant he was not entirely composed. He stopped when he saw Julian sitting at the table. Not in the chair by the fire, where a guest of uncertain status should have been waiting. At the table, upright, hands loosely folded, looking at Edmund Hartwell with an expression so neutral it was almost aggressive in its neutrality. Edmund recovered quickly. He always did. It was one of the things Eliza genuinely had to give him credit for. The man could pivot. "Julian," he said warmly, as if they were old friends who'd planned this meeting weeks ago. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Well enough," Julian said. Edmund pulled out a chair and sat without waiting to be invited, which was his way of establishing territory. "My daughter tells me you have business to discuss." "I do, land business," she said. "That's right." Edmund smiled the smile of a man who is very certain he has the upper hand. "Well, I'm always happy to discuss land. What is it you're looking to buy?" "I have several parcels coming available in the spring, good farmland, well-drained, reasonable price for the right." "I'm not here to buy," Julian said. Edmund stopped. "I'm here," Julian said, and he reached into the canvas bag at his feet and set a folded document on the table between them, "because your lease agreement on the eastern fields expired 14 months ago. You've been farming land you don't have rights to, Mr. Hartwell, and the owner would like it addressed." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room's temperature drops 10 degrees in a single second. Eliza, standing by the window with her tea, did not move. Edmund stared at the document, then at Julian, then at the document again. "I don't know what you think you're." "The lease was drawn in 1809, Julian said. 15 years. It expired in October of last year. Your solicitor was notified in March, in June, and again in September." He paused. "You haven't responded to any of the correspondence." "I deal with a great many solicitors." "You deal with 3, Julian said. "I know their names. I know what they've written to you. I know what you've written back." He folded his hands on the table. "Or rather, I know what you haven't." Edmund's composure was still there, but it was working very hard now. Eliza could see the effort of it, the particular stiffness around his jaw, the way his eyes had stopped smiling, even though his mouth was still going through the motions. "And who exactly," Edmund said carefully, "are you representing?" Julian looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not representing anyone," he said. "I am the owner." 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then Edmund laughed. It was a short, reflexive sound, the kind that escapes before a person's brain catches up to the situation. He looked at Julian's coat, his boots. "They can't be serious." "I'm Julian Everhart," Julian said. "Duke of Ravensmere. And those are my fields you've been farming for the past 14 months, without a valid lease, without payment, and without the courtesy of a single written reply." Edmund Hartwell had been a successful merchant for 30 years. He had survived bad harvests and failed partnerships and a fire that took his first warehouse. He was not by any reasonable standard a man who was easily rattled. He looked rattled now. He stopped, restarted. "You came here last night, you looked like a—" "I know what I looked like," Julian said. "That was intentional." Eliza set her teacup down very carefully. Edmund turned to look at her, as if she might offer some explanation, some lifeline, some version of this that made more sense. She looked back at him and gave him nothing. Because she had nothing, she was standing in the same room, hearing the same words, doing the same arithmetic. The ragged man, the Duke. Her father's joke, "Take my eldest daughter." Nobody here seems to want her anyway. She felt the blood drain from her face. Not from embarrassment, she was past embarrassment. She had metabolized embarrassment years ago, but from something colder. Something that felt like the ground shifting under her feet in the dark. Edmund turned back to Julian, and something happened to Edmund Hartwell's face in that moment that Eliza had seen only a handful of times in her life. The performance dropped. Not the composure, not the social machinery, but the performance of being someone who had the upper hand. It dropped, and underneath it was just a man who had miscalculated badly and knew it. "Your Grace," he said. His voice had changed. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me 14 months of lease payments," Julian said. "The apology is secondary." Edmund nodded, like a man accepting terms after a battle he'd already lost. Of course, I'll have my solicitor." "I'd like to discuss the terms of a new lease," Julian said. "The existing rate is no longer viable. The land has been improved since 1809. I'll have figures to you within the week." He stood, picked up the document. "In the meantime, I have some questions about the management of the northern pasture. I was told there's been drainage work. I'd like to see it." Yes, absolutely. I'll have my steward. I'd like Miss Hartwell to show me," Julian said. Silence. Edmund blinked. "I beg your daughter," Julian said. "She seems to know the property, and I'd rather not wait for your steward to be located and briefed." He looked at Eliza. Not asking permission, but she thought checking. Making sure it was all right, if that's acceptable. Eliza looked at her father. Edmund looked like a man doing very complicated mathematics very fast. "Of course," he said. His voice was perfectly pleasant. Of course Eliza would be delighted. Eliza said nothing. She picked up her coat from the chair by the door, where she'd left it, because she had learned long ago to have her coat close. She walked out without waiting for either of them. Julian followed. The moment they were outside and the door was closed behind them, she turned and looked at him directly. "You knew," she said, "last night. You knew exactly who you were the entire time." "Yes," he said. "No. Why not?" He held her gaze. Because I needed to see the house as it actually was, he said. Not as it would have been if I'd arrived with my title. People behave differently when they know they're being observed by someone who matters. I needed to see the truth of it, and what did you see? She asked. Her voice was very controlled. I saw what I expected to see, he said. From most of it, a pause, and then I saw some things I didn't expect. She studied him. You should have told me. Yes, he said. Simply, without defense, I should have. I'm sorry. She looked away down the gravel path toward the fields. The morning was cold and damp, the grass still holding last night's rain in silver beads that caught the thin winter light. The northern pasture is this way, she said, and she walked. He walked beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the particular kind that happens between two people who have said enough difficult things and are taking a breath before the next ones. How bad is it? She said finally. The lease for my father. That depends on what he does next, Julian said. The arrears are significant. If he'd responded to the correspondence, we could have renegotiated before it reached this point. He chose not to, he paused, or someone chose not to on his behalf. I don't know yet which, his solicitor, Eliza said. Mr. Greer, he manages most of my father's correspondence. My father signs what's put in front of him and trusts that it's been handled. And is it handled? She looked at the ground. Not always. Julian was quiet for a moment. You know a great deal about your family's business for someone who's kept entirely out of it. I'm not kept out of it, she said. I'm just not invited in. There's a difference. People talk around you when they think you're not worth listening to, and if you pay attention, you learn more than they'd ever tell you on purpose. He looked at her. She felt it, that particular quality of attention he had, the kind that didn't slide past you but actually landed. What do you know, he said carefully, about the northern pasture drainage work? She almost stopped walking. Why? Because someone paid for it, he said. And it wasn't my steward, and it wasn't your father. He doesn't have that kind of liquid capital right now. And the work was done well. Better than anything my own people would have done at that price. A pause. So someone with knowledge and resources, and a reason to invest in land they didn't legally control, commissioned it. And I'd like to know who. Eliza was quiet for 4 steps. 5, 6. How much do you know about my father's arrangement with Lord Ashby? She said. Julian stopped walking. She kept walking. He caught up. Tell me. Lord Ashby has been advancing my father money against the expectation of favorable lease terms on the eastern fields, she said. Her voice was level, factual, the voice of someone reporting information they've been holding for a long time, waiting for the right place to put it down. He paid for the drainage work. He expects that work to increase the value of a lease he's planning to take over from my father when my father can no longer service the debt. Julian said nothing. My father doesn't know I know, she said. I heard him and Ashby talking in the study 6 months ago. I was bringing in the tea, and the door was open, and they stopped talking when they saw me, but not before I heard enough. Why didn't you say anything? To whom? She said. It came out flat and honest and carried the weight of a question she'd turned over many times. To my father, who would have told me I'd misunderstood and sent me out of the room. To my mother, who would have told me it was none of my business. She glanced at him. There was no one to tell. Until now, Julian looked at her. And she saw it again, that thing she'd seen last night, that thing she still didn't have a name for. Not pity, not admiration in the showy sense, something quieter than either. The specific, careful look of a person who recognizes weight. You've been carrying that for 6 months, he said. I've been carrying things longer than that, she said. They reached the northern pasture. The drainage work was obvious once you knew to look for it. New channels cut at careful angles, stone-lined, efficient. Good work, expensive work. Julian stood and looked at it for a long moment. Miss Hartwell, he said. Eliza, she said, please. Miss Hartwell, from you after last night feels strange. A pause. Eliza. He said it carefully, like he was checking the weight of it. What I'm about to do is going to disrupt your family considerably. The lease renegotiation, the Ashby arrangement, all of it. He turned to look at her. I want you to know that I'll do what I can to ensure you're not harmed by it. Whatever happens with your father and Ashby, that's not about you." She looked at him. "I don't need protecting," she said. "I need honesty. I need to know what's happening in my own home. I've been managed and handled and kept comfortable and ignorant my whole life, and I am—" She stopped. Steadied herself. "I am so tired of not knowing things that affect me." "Then I'll tell you everything," he said, "as it develops. Whatever I know, you'll know." She studied his face, looking for the performance, the angle, the thing underneath the offer. She didn't find one. "All right," she said. They stood for a moment in the thin winter light, the pasture stretching out behind them, the house visible in the distance with its tall windows catching the gray sky. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why did you really come yourself? A duke doesn't walk 14 miles to collect a lease dispute. He sends someone. He writes a letter. He applies pressure through the appropriate channels." She looked at him. "Why did you come?" Julian was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because I've been sending people for a long time," he said finally. "And people bring back the version of things they think I want to see. I wanted to see for myself." He paused. "I've learned over the years that the truth of a place lives in the parts of it that aren't prepared for observation." "And what's the truth of this place?" she said. He looked at the house, at the pasture, then at her. "That it's being held together," he said, "by the one person in it who isn't supposed to matter." She looked away. Something had tightened in her throat. "Don't," she said quietly. "It's not flattery," he said. "It's just what I saw." "It doesn't matter what you saw," she said. "It doesn't change anything." "Maybe not today," he said. She walked back toward the house and he followed, and she didn't ask what he meant by that, because she was afraid of what she might do if the answer was what she thought it was. She was afraid she might believe it. They were halfway back when they saw Lady Cordelia Vane's carriage coming up the gravel drive. Eliza went still. "You know her?" Julian said quietly. He had seen her face. "Everyone in Hampshire knows her," Eliza said. Her voice had changed, flattened, gone careful. "She's Lord Ashby's cousin. She winters at Ashby Park." A pause. "She's been pursuing an arrangement with your family. Your estate, for the past 2 seasons." Julian looked at the carriage. "An arrangement. That's the polite word for it." He said nothing for a moment. "How much does she know about Ravensmere's holdings in this county?" "More than anyone who isn't a solicitor should," Eliza said. The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door, and Lady Cordelia Vane stepped out with the particular grace of a woman who has practiced stepping out of carriages for so long it has become a weapon. She was beautiful. That was simply true, and Eliza had no interest in being dishonest about it. Dark hair, pale skin, a green dress that had cost more than everything in Eliza's wardrobe combined. She moved across the gravel with the confident ease of someone who knew, in any room she entered, that she was the most remarkable person in it. She saw Julian and stopped. Not with surprise. Eliza watched her face closely enough to see that the surprise was managed, controlled, folded away in less than a second. What replaced it was something smoother and more dangerous. "Pleasure, Julian," she said, and the name in her voice was a whole other word, warm, familiar, carrying the weight of a history that Eliza suddenly very much wanted to know the shape of. "I had no idea you were in Hampshire, Lady Cordelia," Julian said. His voice was perfectly polite, perfectly even, and perfectly, entirely neutral, the kind of neutral that doesn't happen by accident. Cordelia's gaze moved to Eliza. It was very brief. The kind of look that takes a full inventory in under 2 seconds and considers itself done. "Miss Hartwell," she said, with a smile that was correct in every technical respect. "How unexpected, Lady Cordelia," Eliza said, with a smile that was equally correct. "I was calling on your mother," Cordelia said, the explanation directed at Eliza but her attention already drifting back to Julian. "We've been planning the winter assembly, but what a lovely surprise to find," she gestured lightly, at Julian, as if his presence in the county was a gift she hadn't expected but thoroughly deserved. "I had thought you were in London until December." "Plans change," Julian said. "They do," Cordelia said. And her voice had that particular quality, warm, intimate, designed to make the listener feel they were in a private conversation even in an open space. You must come to Ashby Park. Charles will want to see you. And I have been quite eager to speak with you about something. I'm sure you have, Julian said, still neutral. Cordelia's eyes moved to Eliza again. This time they stayed a fraction longer. Miss Hartwell, you must be cold. You should go inside. I'll keep His Grace company. While His Grace, Eliza said, was just finishing a survey of the northern pasture. I was showing him the drainage work. She held Cordelia's gaze without blinking. We were almost done. Something moved in Cordelia's face. Small, precise, the way a chess player looks when a piece moves unexpectedly. Of course, she said, I'll wait inside. She went. The moment she was through the door, Eliza exhaled. Just slightly, just once. She's the reason you were making inquiries, she said. Not a question. Julian glanced at her. What makes you say that? Because she's Lord Ashby's cousin, and Lord Ashby is involved in a scheme to acquire your land. And a woman like that doesn't travel 30 miles from London to plan a winter assembly. She looked at him. She came to find out what you know. Julian looked at the door through which Cordelia had disappeared. You said she's been pursuing an arrangement with my family for 2 seasons, he said. With your estate, Eliza said. I think the distinction matters to her. A pause. He said quietly. I think it does too. They stood for a moment, and Eliza felt the shape of the morning reconfigure itself, the land business, the arrears, Ashby, and now Cordelia Vane, and underneath all of it the slow, inexorable sense of something much larger than a lease dispute. How deep does it go, she asked, what Ashby is doing? Julian looked at her, and she saw it again, the calculation, the weighing, and this time she watched him make the decision. Deep, he said, and Ashby isn't the only one involved. Cordelia, she has her own reasons for wanting access to Ravensmere's income. What reasons? Her family lost a great deal of money, he said. 3 years ago. Bad investments. The Ashby connection keeps her comfortable but not secure. A marriage to a duke would he stopped. Solve everything, Eliza finished. Yes, she looked at the house. She's not going to like finding you here, she said. With me, no, Julian agreed. She isn't. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, she's going to say something about me to you. Probably today or very soon. Something designed to make whatever this is, she gestured vaguely between them. Irrelevant. Julian looked at her. Whatever this is. She met his gaze, you know what I mean. He was very still for a moment. What do you think she'll say? That I'm nobody, Eliza said. Simply, plainly, with the ease of someone reciting a fact they've heard so often it's lost its sting. That I have no position, no fortune, no social currency. That my father is a merchant who's been living beyond his means on borrowed money. That I'm the kind of woman men are kind to in private and don't mention in public. She paused. She won't be lying, not about the facts. Julian looked at her for a long moment. Eliza, he said. She waited. The first time I saw you last night, he said, was through the window of the sitting room. You were standing at the wall, alone, holding a glass of wine you weren't drinking, and you were watching the room with an expression like. He stopped. Started again, like someone taking a very long and very clear-eyed look at a performance they've seen too many times to be impressed by anymore. She said nothing. I've been in a great many rooms, he said. I've watched a great many people. And the ones who see clearly really see clearly, without anger, without bitterness, just clearly are the rarest kind. He held her gaze. Lady Cordelia can say what she likes. What she says won't change what I've seen. The silence between them was different now. Something had shifted in it. You've known me for less than a day, she said carefully. I know, he said, but I've been watching people for a long time. And I know the difference between a person who has value and a person who's been told they don't. He paused. You're not the joke in this story, Eliza. You never were. She looked away. She had to. Something had cracked open in her chest again, that same thing from last night, and she was not going to let it happen in front of him, in the middle of a gravel path, with Cordelia Vane somewhere on the other side of the door. Come inside, she said. Her voice was steady. There's more tea. And you're going to need your strength for whatever she has planned. He made a sound brief, almost not quite a laugh. She walked toward the door. He followed. And somewhere behind them, in the cold morning light, the pasture sat quietly with its careful drainage and its complicated history, and everything that had been set in motion was still moving, gathering speed, the way things do when the right people finally start paying attention to the right questions. Inside the house, Beatrice Hartwell was pouring tea for Lady Cordelia Vane in the good drawing room, and Lady Cordelia was smiling and charming and asking, with the most exquisite casualness imaginable, how long exactly the Duke of Ravensmere had been staying at Hartwell Manor. And Beatrice, who had not known until this moment who the ragged man was, went very pale and very still. And then she set down the teapot and said, with the particular steadiness of a woman rapidly recalculating the value of every decision she'd made in the last 24 hours, he arrived last evening. He'll be staying as long as he needs, and Cordelia's smile stayed exactly where it was. But her eyes went somewhere cold, and somewhere in those cold eyes was the beginning of something that was going to make Eliza Hartwell's life very, very difficult. Beatrice Hartwell found her daughter in the kitchen. Not the drawing room, not the parlor, not anywhere a woman of her station should have been found at 11 in the morning with a duke under her roof. The kitchen, sitting at the rough wooden table with Mrs. Poole, the two of them bent over a ledger that had no business being in a kitchen, talking in low voices about winter stores. Eliza. Beatrice's voice could cut glass when she wanted it to. A word. Eliza looked up. She read her mother's face in under a second, the controlled brightness of it, the way her eyes were doing that rapid inventory they did when she was recalculating, and she closed the ledger and stood without being asked twice. They went to the small sitting room. Beatrice closed the door behind them. Why, her mother said, in the voice she used when she was performing calm over something that was nowhere near calm, did I have to learn from Lady Cordelia Vane that the man sleeping in our kitchen quarters is the Duke of Ravensmere? Because father didn't tell you, Eliza said, or he didn't know how. Your father is currently hiding in his study pretending to review correspondence. Beatrice's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. Eliza, do you understand what this means? The Duke of Ravensmere was in this house last night, and your father offered you to him like something nobody wanted, Eliza said quietly. Yes, I was there. Beatrice flinched. It was small, but Eliza caught it, and she filed it away in the place where she kept all the things her mother almost felt. This can be managed, Beatrice said, recovering. Lady Cordelia doesn't need to make anything of it. If we frame it correctly, if you are seen to have been gracious, attentive, appropriate in your behavior toward His Grace. I have been appropriate, Eliza said. You walked the fields with him unchaperoned this morning. I showed him the drainage work on the northern pasture, which is directly relevant to the lease dispute he came here to address, which incidentally affects whether we continue to have a home. Beatrice stared at her. What lease dispute? Eliza looked at her mother. The Eastern Fields lease expired 14 months ago, Mother. Father hasn't paid or renegotiated. Lord Ashby has been advancing money against the expectation of taking over the lease when Father defaults. And the Duke came here to find out why nobody has responded to 14 months of legal correspondence. The color drained from Beatrice's face. How do you know all of that? I pay attention, Eliza said. I've been paying attention for years. Nobody notices when I do it, which is probably why I know more about this family's situation than anyone who's supposed to be running it. Beatrice sat down. She sat down in the way that people do when their legs stop being reliable. She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at them and said nothing for a long moment. How bad is it? She said finally. Bad enough that we need the Duke to agree to favorable terms, Eliza said. And bad enough that the worst thing we can do right now is let Lady Cordelia convince him that this family isn't worth his patience. Beatrice looked up, and for the first time in longer than Eliza could remember, her mother looked at her without the layer of assessment, without calculating her social value or her matrimonial prospects or the probability of her being embarrassing. She just looked at her. What do we do? She said. Eliza picked up the ledger from where she'd set it by the door. Start by telling me everything you actually know about Father's arrangement with Ashby. Not what you think I should know everything. Beatrice hesitated. Eliza's voice was patient and implacable. Everything, Beatrice told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was worse than Eliza had thought, which was saying something because she had thought it was quite bad. Ashby had advanced Edmund Hartwell nearly £4,000 over 3 years. The notes were callable on 60 days' notice. Edmund had used the money to maintain the lifestyle, the parties, the clothes, Beatrice's jewelry, the appearance of prosperity, while quietly watching the actual foundations of that prosperity crumble. And Greer, the solicitor, had been managing the correspondence in ways that kept Edmund comfortable and uninformed, and Ashby's position quietly, steadily stronger. When Beatrice finished, Eliza sat still for a moment and did the arithmetic. "All right," she said, "all right." Beatrice stared at her. "Eliza, we could lose everything." "We won't," Eliza said. "Not if I handle this correctly." "You?" The word came out before Beatrice could stop it, with all the involuntary weight of 24 years of underestimating her daughter. She heard it herself. She had the grace to look away. "Yes," Eliza said, without anger, without the satisfaction of being right about being underestimated, which would have been understandable but wasn't useful. "Me now go and be hospitable to Lady Cordelia. Don't tell her anything she doesn't already know. And whatever she asks about His Grace and me, answer her as if the question bores you." Why? Because nothing annoys Cordelia Vane more than someone who isn't impressed enough to be threatened. Beatrice looked at her daughter for a long moment. "When did you become?" "I've always been this," Eliza said. "You just weren't watching." She left her mother sitting at the table and went to find Julian. He was in the library. She hadn't expected that she'd expected to find him in the drawing room, managing Cordelia, or in the study, confronting her father. Instead, he was standing in front of the bookshelf, with a volume open in his hands, reading with the easy focus of someone who knows how to find stillness in a complicated situation. He heard her come in and looked up. "Your mother knows," Eliza said. "I assumed she would by now," he said. He closed the book and set it on the shelf. "Lady Cordelia," she told her within 5 minutes of arriving. Probably sooner. Eliza came into the room and sat in the chair by the window. "She's in the drawing room with my mother right now." "Being charming." "Cordelia is excellent at charming," Julian said. He said it without admiration or bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of a person assessing a known quantity. "She's looking for information," Eliza said, "about what you know. About what you're planning to do about Ashby." Julian looked at her. "How do you know that's what she's after?" "Because it's what I'd be after in her position." She held his gaze. "She's not stupid. She knows the Ashby arrangement is exposed. She's trying to find out how much you know before you act. And if I've already decided what to do, then what she finds out today won't matter." Eliza paused. "Have you?" He sat down in the chair across from her. "I need one more piece of information," he said. "The notes Ashby holds against your father. Are they legitimate?" "The debt is real," she said. "Whether the terms are legitimate depends on what Greer put in the agreements. I haven't seen the actual documents. Could you get them?" She looked at him. "From my father's study? Yes." "You're asking me to go through my father's papers." "I'm asking if it's possible," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with." She was quiet for a moment. The truth was, she'd been in her father's study without permission more times than she could count, not to spy, not to cause harm, but because the study was where the household accounts lived. And someone had to understand them, and that someone had always quietly been her. "I'll look," she said, "but Julian," she stopped. "What?" "Whatever you find in those documents," she said carefully, "I need you to remember that my father he's not a villain. He's a fool. There's a difference. He's been managed and flattered and strategically kept ignorant by people who are much better at this than he is. And he's made choices he shouldn't have made. But he's not." She pressed her hands together. "He embarrassed me last night in front of 30 people without thinking twice about it. I know what he is. I'm not defending him. I'm just asking you to see the whole thing clearly." Julian looked at her for a long time. "You're protecting him," he said. "Even now, I'm being accurate," she said. "It's not the same thing." Most people in your position would be perfectly happy to let him burn. Most people in my position, she said, haven't spent 24 years watching what happens to a family when it comes apart. It doesn't just hurt the people who deserve it. She met his gaze. It hurts everyone in it. Julian was very still. I'll take all of it into account, he said finally. You have my word. She nodded, stood. I'll get the documents this afternoon when Father is at lunch. She was at the door when he said Eliza. She turned. What you just said, about seeing the whole thing clearly. He looked at her with that look. The one she still hadn't found the right word for. You do that for everyone, don't you? See them clearly. All of them, I try, she said. Has anyone ever done it for you? The question landed quietly and went somewhere deep. She didn't answer it. She couldn't. She went out and pulled the door closed behind her and stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hand still on the doorknob, breathing. Has anyone ever done it for you? No, she thought. Not until approximately 36 hours ago. And that was the most dangerous thought she'd had in years. She went to get the documents. Her father's study was empty. Edmund was at lunch. As predicted, she'd heard him in the dining room with Thomas, the particular sound of a man eating in silence, which was Edmund's version of hiding. She slipped in, went straight to the locked drawer in the lower left of the desk she'd known, where the key was since she was 17, kept under the edge of the second bookshelf. Behind the complete works of Cicero that nobody had ever read, and opened it. The Ashby notes were there, 3 of them, folded, sealed with red wax that had already been broken and repressed, which told her someone had read them recently and wanted them to look unread. She took them to the window for the light and read quickly, her lips pressed together, her mind filing each clause with the efficiency of someone who has taught themselves to read legal language out of necessity. By the time she reached the end of the 3rd document, she understood what Greer had done. The notes were legitimate in their amounts. The interest terms were not usurious in themselves. But the repayment conditions, the specific language in the 3rd document, the clause on page 4, had a provision that her father almost certainly hadn't understood when he'd signed. A provision that gave Ashby the right to call the entire debt, not on 60 days' notice as Edmund believed, but on 30 days' notice, triggered at Ashby's sole discretion, at any time that a third party made a claim on the Eastern Fields. A third party, like, for instance, the Duke of Ravensmere, arriving to address a 14-month lease dispute. Eliza set the documents down on the desk and looked at the wall. Ashby had been waiting for this. He'd constructed the entire arrangement to detonate the moment the Duke showed up. Edmund would be called on the debt within 30 days of Julian's arrival. He couldn't pay, he'd never been able to pay, that was the design. The Eastern Fields would go to Ashby, and Ashby, as the new leaseholder, would have leverage over the entire estate. She picked up the documents, put them back exactly as she'd found them. Relocked the drawer, put the key back behind Cicero. And then she went quickly and without stopping, directly to the library. Julian took one look at her face when she came through the door. What did you find? He said. She told him all of it. Quickly, precisely, without editorializing. He listened without interrupting, and she watched his face as she laid it out, the clause, the 30-day trigger, the way the whole thing had been constructed, and she watched something move through his expression. Not surprise. He wasn't surprised by Ashby's capacity for this. What moved through his face was something colder and more focused. Understanding. The specific understanding of a man who has just seen the full shape of something he'd only seen pieces of before. When she finished, he stood up. 30 days, he said. From the moment you arrived, she said, which means the clock started last night. He was quiet for a moment. Greer drew this up, yes. On Ashby's instruction, almost certainly, and your father signed it without reading it properly. My father, she said, signs what Greer puts in front of him. That's been true for years. Julian crossed to the window. Stood there for a moment with his back to her. She could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, not anger, not panic, but the particular physical stillness of a man who is thinking very fast and very hard. If Ashby calls the debt, he said, your father has 30 days to pay £4,000 he doesn't have. Yes, and you lose the house. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He turned, and the look on his face was one she hadn't seen from him yet, stripped of the careful neutrality, the measured steadiness. Just direct, decided. I'm not going to let that happen, he said. She looked at him. Julian, I have grounds to challenge the clause. The trigger condition is predicated on a third-party claim on the eastern fields. My presence here is not a claim, it's a courtesy visit to address an administrative matter. If Greer tries to use it to activate that provision, I'll have my own solicitor in front of a magistrate before the ink dries. That takes time, she said, and money and a court's cooperation. I have all three, he said. In abundance, she studied him. You'd do that for a family for you, he said. Simply, and because it's the right thing, those two reasons happen to align. The silence between them was the kind that has weight. The kind you can feel. You can't keep doing that, she said quietly. Doing what? Saying things like that. She looked at him. You've known me for less than 2 days. You don't. You shouldn't. I know what I see, he said. I told you that this morning. Seeing something clearly doesn't mean you owe it anything, she said. No, he agreed, it doesn't. He held her gaze, but sometimes you see something and you choose. That's different from owing. She opened her mouth. Closed it. The door opened. Lady Cordelia Vane stepped into the library with the ease of someone who has never in her life opened a door and found herself unwelcome. She looked from Julian to Eliza and back again, and the smile on her face was precisely correct, warm, unbothered, the smile of a woman who has walked into exactly the situation she expected and has already decided what to do about it. Julian, she said, your mother's been asking for you. In London, I had a letter from the Duchess just last week. She's worried about the Ravensmere accounts. A pause, perfectly weighted. She'll be relieved to know you've been attending to things personally. I'm sure she will, Julian said. Cordelia's gaze moved to Eliza. This time it stayed. Miss Hartwell, you've been so helpful today. Walking the fields, showing his grace around. The warmth in her voice was extraordinary, genuine seeming to anyone who didn't know how to listen for the blade in it. You must be exhausted. You should rest. I'm fine, Eliza said pleasantly. I've been talking with your mother, Cordelia continued, moving into the room as if it were already hers, settling into a chair with the natural ease of ownership. She's been telling me about your work with the village children. The reading lessons. A smile, how very kind. Such a useful way to spend one's time for a woman who isn't occupied elsewhere. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Julian said the reading lessons are more than kind. Cordelia looked at him. Something flickered, of course. The literacy rate in this part of Hampshire, Julian said, is considerably better than the surrounding counties. My steward mentioned it. I asked why. Apparently the answer is a school that's been running for 3 years, funded by one person without any institutional support. He glanced at Eliza. I didn't know until this morning whose it was. Cordelia's smile didn't waver. But her eyes recalculated. Fast, how charming, she said. And then, smoothly, seamlessly, she turned back to Julian and said, I wanted to speak with you about Ravensmere's Eastern holdings. Actually, Charles has some thoughts about the development potential, if you'd be willing to take a walk. I'm in the middle of something, Julian said, a pause. Brief but audible, of course, Cordelia said, the smile held. Later, then, she stood unhurried, Miss Hartwell. Perfectly pleasant, she left. The room was very quiet. She's going to write to someone tonight, Eliza said. Ashby, probably, telling him exactly how much you know. I know, Julian said, which means Ashby is going to act faster than we thought. He might not wait for 30 days. He might call the debt immediately, try to move before you can mount a legal challenge. That's possible. Then we have less time than we thought. Julian looked at her. We said. She stopped, heard herself. Ah, yes. Don't apologize for it, he said. We, that's right. She looked at him across the library, her grandfather's library, full of unread books and accumulated dust, and the particular sadness of a house that had been slowly losing ground for years, and she felt it again. That thing that had started the moment he'd looked at her, across a room full of laughter, and not laughed. I need to go to the village this afternoon, she said. The school. Even now? Especially now, she said. Those children are waiting. Whatever is happening in this house doesn't change that. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll ride with you, he said. I know, he said, I want to. He paused. There's a difference. She recognized her own words. Something moved in her chest. She almost smiled, and then did small, real, the kind that arrives before you can make a decision about it. All right, she said, 2 o'clock. She left the library. She was halfway down the hall when Thomas appeared from the direction of the drawing room, with the expression he reserved for news he found distasteful. Miss Hartwell, he said, Lord Ashby has arrived. She went still now. His carriage came up the drive not 5 minutes ago. He's in the drawing room with Lady Cordelia and your mother. Eliza turned around, walked back to the library door. Opened it. Julian looked up. Ashby is here, she said. He stood up immediately. That was fast, he said. Cordelia didn't write to him, Eliza said. She didn't have to. He was already on his way. She looked at Julian. He knew you were here before she did. He's had someone watching. Julian was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, where's your father? Still in the dining room, I think. Get him, Julian said, before Ashby does, and Eliza, he caught her eye. Don't let him go into that drawing room without you. She was already moving. She found her father pushing back from the dining room table, and she came in fast and said, in the voice that didn't leave room for argument, Lord Ashby is here, and we need to talk before you see him. Edmund looked up. His face did something complicated. Ashby? He wasn't invited, Eliza said. He came because the Duke is here and he's frightened. She sat down across from him and said quickly, without softening it, Father. I've read the agreements, the Ashby notes. I know about the 30-day clause. Edmund's face went through 5 different expressions in under 4 seconds. She watched him land, finally, on the one she'd been waiting for, not anger, not denial, but something that was almost relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told that someone else finally knows. Eliza, she said later, right now I need you to listen to me. When you go into that drawing room, do not agree to anything Ashby says. Do not confirm anything. Do not sign anything. Whatever he presents you with, tell him you need to consult with His Grace first. Edmund blinked. Consult with the Duke? Eliza, Ashby is not your friend, she said. He built a trap and he's been waiting for you to walk into it for 3 years. The Duke knows about it. The Duke has resources Ashby doesn't. And if you trust his advice over Ashby's for the next 24 hours, we might come through this intact. Her father looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked the way he had when she was very small, before the parties and the performance and the years of managed appearances. He looked like someone who didn't know quite what he was doing, but was starting to understand that someone nearby did. All right, he said. It was the simplest thing he'd said to her in years. They walked into the drawing room together. Ashby was standing by the fireplace, which was the power position in the room, and they all knew it. He was a broad man, red-faced, with the particular physical ease of someone who has always been larger than the people around him and learned to use it. Cordelia sat near the window, composed, watching everything. Beatrice sat between them, managing the room with the particular desperation of a hostess who feels the temperature dropping and keeps refilling cups. Ashby saw Edmund first, smiled. Edmund, good to see you, man. Didn't expect to find you at home, I thought, with the Duke in residence you'd be. He stopped. Saw Eliza. Something moved in his face, very briefly. Then Julian came in behind her. The room changed. It didn't shift gradually. It changed. The way a room changes when the largest thing in it becomes suddenly unmistakably visible, when everyone in the space recalibrates simultaneously, without deciding to. Ashby's smile stayed on his face, but his eyes were doing something different from his smile. Your Grace, he said, warmly, enormously warm, the warmth of a man who has been caught and is betting everything on charm. What an unexpected pleasure. I had no idea you were in Hampshire. Lord Ashby, Julian said. He was perfectly pleasant. Perfectly neutral. The absolute weaponized neutrality Eliza was beginning to understand was his most dangerous register. "I was just thinking about you." "Were you?" Ashby said. "I was reviewing some documents this morning," Julian said, settling into a chair with the ease of a man who is entirely comfortable in any room he enters. "Related to the Eastern Fields lease, and your name came up in a rather interesting context." Ashby laughed. It was a good laugh, full, natural, almost convincing. "I can imagine. Edmund and I have been in discussions about the lease. I've been trying to help him find a path forward, actually." "Given the difficulties, that's very kind," Julian said. "Tell me about the 30-day clause." The laugh stopped. Not dramatically, it just ran out, like a clock that's wound down. "I beg your pardon?" Ashby said. "The repayment clause," Julian said. "In the third agreement, page 4, the provision that triggers accelerated repayment upon any third-party claim on the Eastern Fields." He looked at Ashby with absolute pleasantness. "I'm curious about the intent behind that particular language." Ashby looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at his hands. He said nothing. He had been told to say nothing, and for once in his life he was listening to the right person. Ashby looked at Cordelia. Cordelia was looking out the window with an expression of exquisite neutrality. He looked back at Julian. "That's a standard provision," Ashby said. "Any solicitor would, my solicitor wouldn't," Julian said. "Because my solicitor understands that a provision designed to be activated by a landlord addressing his own estate is not standard. It's targeted." He paused. "Would you like to tell me what you were planning to do with the Eastern Fields once Edmund defaulted?" The room was so quiet that Eliza could hear the fire. Ashby put down his cup, and when he looked at Julian, the charm was gone. Fully, completely gone, like a coat he'd stopped needing. What was underneath it was not what Eliza had expected. It wasn't villainy, not exactly. It was just business. Cold, calculated, patient business. "I was planning to acquire a productive lease on valuable farmland at below market rate," Ashby said. "Through a legally executed agreement that Edmund signed of his own free will." "Edmund signed," Julian said, "because his solicitor told him it was standard language and he trusted him. Greer works for you, doesn't he? Not in any formal capacity, nothing traceable. But you've been paying him." The silence stretched. That, Ashby said quietly, would be a very serious allegation. "Yes," Julian said, "it would." They looked at each other. And in that look was a conversation that had nothing to do with words, the specific, silent negotiation of two men who understand exactly what each of them has and what each of them is willing to use it. Eliza watched it happen. She kept her hands still in her lap and her face arranged, and she watched, and she felt, for the first time since this had all started, that the ground under her feet was something she could trust. Not because Julian had power, not because he had money or title or legal resources. Because he had chosen to use all of it facing in the right direction. Ashby stood. "I'll be in touch," he said to Edmund. His voice was controlled, professional, the voice of a man retreating tactically, not surrendering. "There are things to discuss." "Go through my solicitor," Julian said. "Not Edmund's." "Another beat, of course," Ashby said. He left. Cordelia left with him, gliding out with a last look at Eliza, brief, precise, and full of something that was not going to go away simply because today had not gone well. The drawing room was very quiet. Edmund Hartwell sat in his chair and looked at the floor. He looked, Eliza thought, like a man who had just been shown the full dimensions of a hole he'd been standing in for 3 years. "Edmund," Julian said. His voice had changed, not softer, but without the edge. The voice of a man who is choosing the right tool for the moment. "I'm going to need to look at everything. All of the agreements. All of the correspondence with Greer, all of it." Edmund nodded. He didn't argue, he didn't perform, he just nodded. Beatrice reached across and put her hand over her husband's. It was the most genuine thing Eliza had seen her mother do in years. She slipped out of the room quietly and went to the hallway and stood there for a moment, back against the wall, and breathed. She pressed her hands flat against the cold plaster and felt it solid behind her, and breathed and did not let herself shake. She heard footsteps. Julian came out of the drawing room and found her there. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then honestly, "Not entirely." "That's a reasonable response," he said. "Is it over?" she asked. "With Ashby? No," he said. "He'll try something else." Men like Ashby always have another angle, Cordelia too. "Yes," she looked at the ceiling. "So this isn't finished." "No," he said, "but the shape of it is clearer now. And the ground is steadier than it was this morning." He paused. "You gave me the information I needed to do that, you." She looked at him. "We said we." Something shifted in his face. "Warm and careful and real, we," he agreed. She pushed off the wall. Straightened. Put herself back together the way she always did, methodically, piece by piece, the same way she put everything back together. 2 o'clock, she said, the village school. I still have to go. "I'll be ready," he said. She walked down the hall and he watched her go. And somewhere in the house behind them, Edmund Hartwell was being honest for perhaps the first time in years, and Beatrice was holding his hand. And Lady Cordelia Vane was sitting in Ashby's carriage on the gravel drive outside writing a letter. And in that letter she wrote things about Eliza Hartwell that were careful and precise and designed to travel fast. And they would travel fast, and what happened when they arrived would be the hardest thing Eliza had ever had to stand up through. But she didn't know that yet. At 2 o'clock she rode out with a duke at her side, and 20 children waiting in a village schoolroom. And for 1 hour, the complicated, terrible, beautiful thing that her life was becoming narrowed down to 20 small faces and the alphabet and the particular joy of watching someone learn to read a word they'd never read before. And Julian Everhart sat in the back of that schoolroom, on a bench that was too small for him, and watched her teach and said nothing, and understood, with a clarity he hadn't expected and couldn't now unfeel, exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. The kind that was kind when nobody was watching. The kind that didn't stop being that kind when the room filled up. The kind you didn't walk away from. The letter reached London in 4 days. Eliza didn't know that. She was in the village schoolroom on Thursday, and Friday, and Saturday morning, working through the winter reading list she'd put together herself from books she'd bought, with her own household allowance, the small, quarterly sum her father gave her that was meant for gloves and ribbon and other things she rarely bought. She'd been spending it on primers and ink and cheap paper for 3 years, and nobody had noticed, because nobody had been paying attention. Julian noticed. He came back to the schoolroom on Friday. And Saturday. He sat on the too small bench and didn't say much, and the children who had been briefly terrified of him, and then, with the speed that children have, entirely comfortable, started directing questions at him that had nothing to do with reading. One boy named William, 8 years old and missing his 2 front teeth, asked him point-blank whether he owned a horse, and when Julian said yes, William asked how many. And when Julian said 12, the boy looked at him with an expression of such pure, reverent awe that Eliza had to turn away to keep from laughing. 12, William said. 12 horses, 12, Julian confirmed gravely. Could I ride one? William, Eliza said, turning back around with her composure recovered. We're on page 14. But could I? William asked Julian, undisturbed. Julian looked at Eliza. The corner of his mouth moved. If Miss Hartwell says it's all right, he said. William turned to Eliza with the full, devastating force of his gap-toothed sincerity. Page 14, she said. Then we'll discuss horses. They discussed horses at the end of the lesson. Julian crouched down to William's level and talked about horses for 10 minutes with more patience and genuine engagement than Eliza had ever seen a man of his station apply to anything. The boy asked questions that were mostly unanswerable. Do horses dream? Do they know their own names? Can they tell when you're sad? And Julian answered every one of them seriously, without condescension, without checking the time. She watched him do it and felt something shift in her chest that she was getting very tired of trying to put a name to. They rode back to Hartwell Manor in the late afternoon, and for most of the ride they didn't speak, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. The silence between them had changed over the past 4 days into the kind that happens between people who have run out of the need to fill space and have arrived somewhere easier than that. You were good with them, she said finally. The children. They're straightforward, he said. You always know where you are with children. They tell you immediately if they don't like you. William likes you. William likes the horses, Julian said. I'm incidental. He saw it. There it is, he said. She looked at him. There, what is that, he said. When you actually smile, the real one, not the one you use in drawing rooms. She looked forward. I don't know what you mean. You have 3, he said. The polite one, correct, arrives on time, says nothing. The one you use with the children, warmer, genuine, but still managed. And then the one that just happened, which is the one you don't plan. He paused. I've been counting. She was quiet for a moment. That's a strange thing to pay attention to. I pay attention to things, he said. You know that by now. She did know that. That was part of what was frightening about him. They were halfway up the drive when Thomas appeared on the front step with the expression he reserved for truly bad news, not his usual disapproval, but something whiter and more serious than that. Eliza pulled up. What is it? A letter came this afternoon, Miss Hartwell, Thomas said. For your mother. From London. He paused. She's been in her room since she read it. She won't come out. Eliza was off her horse before he finished the sentence. She knocked twice on her mother's door, got no answer, and went in anyway. Beatrice was sitting at her writing desk with the letter in her hands, and the expression on her face was one Eliza had never seen there before, not the controlled distress of social embarrassment, not the managed disappointment of thwarted ambition. Something rawer than that, something that looked, underneath all the layers of propriety, like genuine fear. Mother Eliza came and crouched beside her. What is it? Beatrice held out the letter without speaking. Eliza took it and read it. It was from Lady Margaret Forsyth, who was one of the 3 most formidable women in London society, who had been Beatrice's closest social connection for 15 years, and who had written in the particular warm-seeming language that women like her used to deliver maximum damage with minimum accountability. The letter said, in essence, that there were stories circulating in London, that people were talking about Edmund Hartwell's financial difficulties in specific uncomfortable detail, that questions were being raised about the family's solvency, and that more delicately, more carefully, with the exquisite precision of a knife slid between ribs, that Eliza's name was being mentioned in connection with the Duke of Ravensmere in terms that were not entirely flattering. That some people were saying she had engineered the situation. That some people were using the word calculating. That some people, and Lady Margaret of course, didn't believe any of this. She was simply passing it along as a friend were, saying that the Duke had been trapped by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing when she opened that door in the rain. Eliza read it twice, set it on the desk. Who sent this? She said. Her voice was entirely level. Margaret, Beatrice said. She wouldn't. Cordelia wrote to Margaret, Eliza said. She'd know exactly who to write to. Margaret loves your mother above all things and would never knowingly hurt you, but she also can't keep a secret she believes is kindness. She stood. How many people do you think have heard this already? Beatrice's face was answer enough. Eliza said, how many people in Hampshire? The winter assembly is next week, Beatrice said. It came out barely above a whisper. Everyone will be there. Everyone will have heard by then. Eliza stood for a moment and looked at the letter on the desk and thought about what Cordelia Vane had understood, with her cold, precise intelligence, that most people missed, that the way to destroy a woman like Eliza wasn't to attack her directly. It was to attack her motive, to take the one thing she had, her genuine, uncalculated kindness, and reframe it as strategy. To make the truth look like manipulation. It was elegant in a terrible way. Eliza could almost admire it. I'm going to speak with Julian, she said. Eliza. Her mother's voice stopped her. If you go to him now after this letter, it will look like exactly what she said it was. Eliza turned, looked at her mother. I know, she said. I'm going anyway. She went. Julian was in the library. He always seemed to end up in the library, which she was beginning to understand was where he went to think. He was standing at the window when she came in, and he turned and he read her face before she said a word. Tell me, he said. She told him quickly. The letter, its contents, Cordelia's calculation, the winter assembly, all of it. He listened without interrupting, and she watched him receive it, watched him absorb the specific weight of what had been done and what it was going to mean. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She's trying to separate us," he said. "She's trying to discredit me before I become inconvenient to her," Eliza said. "Whether that separates us is secondary," he looked at her. "Is it?" She met his gaze. "Right now, what matters is that my family's reputation is being dismantled in London drawing rooms, and the Winter Assembly is in 7 days, and I need to think about what to do about it." "What I can do, I know what you can do," she said. "I'm asking you not to." He went very still, "Eliza. If you defend me publicly, if you use your title and your position to shut this down, then everything," Cordelia said, "becomes true. I become the woman the Duke rescued. The woman who needed a powerful man to stand between her and the world." She looked at him steadily. "I've been managing other people's perceptions of me my entire life. I know how this works. If you speak for me, you take away the only thing I have." "Digged my own voice," she said. "Which is different and more important." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him struggle with it, the instinct to act, to use what he had, to put himself between her and the thing coming for her. She watched him fight it, and she respected the fight, even as she needed him to lose it. "What are you going to do?" he said finally. "Go to the assembly," she said. "Stand in the room, let people look at me and make up their own minds." "And if they've already made up their minds? Then I'll change them," she said. "Or I won't, but it will be mine either way." He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. It cost him something. She could see that. "Thank you," she said. She turned to go. "Eliza." His voice stopped her, the way it always did, not loud, just certain. "For what it's worth, and I know you don't want it to be worth anything right now, there is no one in England, and I have met most of England, who would look at you and believe what Cordelia is saying." She stood with her back to him for a moment. "There are people who want to believe it," she said. "That's enough to do damage." "Yes," he said, "but damage isn't the same as truth." She went out. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands together between her knees and breathed for a moment, just breathed, the way she did when something was too large to hold all at once and needed to be broken into pieces. Cordelia had been faster than she expected, smarter than she'd been given credit for. And the assembly was 7 days away, and the whole of Hampshire society would be in one room, and every single one of them would have heard the story by then, would be watching her walk through the door, would be deciding in real time what they believed about her. She thought about what Julian had said, about damage not being the same as truth. She thought about William, asking whether horses could tell when you're sad. She thought about her mother sitting at her writing desk with fear on her face, real fear, the kind that peels back all the performances. She thought about the fact that she had spent 24 years being invisible in her own life, and she was done with that. Done with it in a way that had nothing to do with Julian Everhart and everything to do with herself and what she was going to choose to do with the time she had. She stood up. She went to her writing desk and she started writing. Not a letter, not a defense, not an explanation, not an appeal to anyone's sympathy. She started writing a proposal, a formal proposal, structured and argued and evidenced, for a permanent school in the village. With funding requirements, a proposed schedule, a projected number of students, a detailed account of what 3 years of informal lessons had already achieved. She wrote it the way she'd have written anything she wanted, taken seriously, clearly, precisely, without apology. She wrote until midnight. She didn't show it to anyone. Not yet. The next morning she came downstairs to find her father at breakfast. This in itself was unusual enough. Edmund Hartwell rarely appeared at breakfast, having historically treated it as an opportunity to sleep through something that she stopped in the doorway. He looked up. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He pushed a document across the table to her. She looked at it. It was a letter handwritten in Edmund's large, slightly unsteady script addressed to Lord Ashby. She read it. It was a full accounting everything. The debt, the terms, the history of non-payment, the fact that he understood now how the 30-day clause had been constructed and why. It acknowledged that he had been negligent. It stated clearly that he had retained new legal counsel Julian's solicitor, whose name appeared at the bottom in a secondary signature, and that all further correspondence should be directed there. It was not, she realized as she read it, the letter of a man who had been told what to write. It was the letter of a man who had decided to stop hiding. She looked up at her father. "When did you write this?" she said. "Last night," he said. After you went upstairs, he was looking at the table. At his hands on the table, at the particular geography of his own hands as if he'd forgotten them and was reacquainting himself. His Grace and I talked for 3 hours. He showed me everything Greer had done. All of it, the way the agreements were structured. The payments Greer received, he stopped. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said, "but I should have," he said. "I should have been paying attention. I let it go because it was easier. Because Greer handled it, and I didn't have to think about it, and he stopped again. I've been doing that with a great many things for a great many years." Eliza was very still. "I offered you as a joke," he said. His voice was lower now, in front of 30 people. "I said." He pressed his mouth together. "I've been saying things like that your whole life. I thought you knew I didn't mean." "Father," she said quietly. He looked at her, and in his eyes was something she had not seen there before. Not guilt, exactly, guilt was too simple. Something more complicated. The look of a man confronting the specific itemized cost of a long carelessness. "I mean it," he said, "whatever that's worth." She looked at her father across the breakfast table, this man she'd spent years trying to understand, and years trying not to need, and years carrying despite herself, and she felt the familiar complicated ache of it. "It's worth something," she said. "It doesn't fix anything. But it's worth something." He nodded, like he'd expected that and accepted it. "What happens now?" he said. "With the lease?" "Julian handles Ashby," she said. "You let him. You answer his solicitor's questions honestly, all of them, and you stay out of the way and let the people who know what they're doing do it." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "And the letter Cordelia sent to London," she said. "About me?" Edmund's face changed. "I heard. Beatrice told me this morning." A pause. "Eliza, I don't need you to do anything about it," she said. "I just need you to understand that what she's saying is a lie. Not a partial truth, a lie. I opened the door because it was the right thing to do. That is all I did." "I know," he said. "And whatever you hear over the next week," she said, "whatever people say at the assembly, I need you to tell the truth. Not a version of it, not the version that makes us look better. The truth." He was quiet for a moment. "The truth being that I made a cruel joke and you showed more grace in that moment than I've shown in 30 years of trying to make people laugh." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "that's the truth." He nodded. She picked up her tea and drank it. 3 days before the assembly, the second letter arrived. This one was not from Lady Margaret. This one was from Lady Forsyth herself, the matriarch of London society, 81 years old, who had outlasted 4 monarchs and 7 prime ministers, and had opinions about everything that she delivered with the precision and velocity of someone who had been weaponized language since before so people in the room were born. It was addressed to Eliza. Eliza opened it at the breakfast table, alone, with a small precise feeling in her chest that she was about to read something that mattered. Lady Forsyth wrote she had heard the story going around London. And she had also heard, from 3 separate sources, a different story, the story of a woman who had opened a door in the rain, who had knelt on a cold floor and bandaged a stranger's feet, who had stood at the bottom of a staircase at midnight and ended a man's cruelty with 4 quiet words. She wrote that she was 90% certain the second story was true, and the first was manufactured, because she had known Cordelia Vane for 20 years, and she knew exactly what Cordelia did when she was frightened. She wrote that she would be attending the winter assembly. She had not attended a Hampshire assembly in 11 years, but she would be attending this one. She wrote, "I should like to meet you, Miss Hartwell." Eliza read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, and sat for a moment with her hand pressed flat on the table. Then she went to find Julian. He was as always in the library. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it. His face went through something. She caught it, that movement under the surface, and when he looked up there was something in his eyes that was warm and real, and not quite hidden. "Lady Forsyth," he said. "You know her," Eliza said. "She knew my mother," he said. "She is—" He seemed to search for the right word. "Formidable is too small. She is the kind of person who changes the temperature of a room just by deciding to enter it." "She's coming to the assembly," Eliza said. "I know." He handed back the letter. "That changes things." "How?" "Because Cordelia knows her too," he said. "And if Lady Forsyth has decided to align herself with you before the assembly publicly, by attending then, Cordelia will know the story has gotten away from her." He paused. "She'll try something else. Something at the assembly itself." Eliza looked at him. "You think she'll confront me directly?" "I think she'll try to make you small in front of the right people," he said. "It's what she does. She won't shout or accuse. She's too good for that. She'll say something quiet and precise that puts you at a disadvantage and waits to see how you handle it." "And how do I handle it?" He looked at her steadily. "You already know how," he said. "You've been handling it your whole life." "I've been surviving it," she said. "That's different from handling it." "Is it?" he said. "You're still standing." She looked away. The afternoon light came through the library windows and lay across the dusty floor in long bars. And in the quiet of it she felt, suddenly and very clearly, the full weight of the week, the letter, her father at breakfast, her mother's fear. The assembly coming like weather you can see before it arrives. "I'm frightened," she said. She said it simply without apology. The way she said most true things. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I know that too. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who." She stopped. "Who what?" he said quietly. She looked at him. "Who won't try to make it smaller than it is," she said. "Or bigger. Just who'll let it be the size it actually is." He held her gaze. "It's frightening," he said, "the size it actually is. You're going to walk into a room full of people who've been told a story about you, and you're going to stand there and be yourself and let them decide. And that takes more courage than most things I've seen." She breathed. "And if they decide wrong, then they're wrong," he said. "And you're still you," he paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually everything." She held his gaze for a long moment. The library was quiet around them. Outside, the Hampshire countryside was going gray and gold in the afternoon, and somewhere in London, Cordelia Vane was planning her next move. And somewhere in a village schoolroom 20 children were learning to read words they'd never read before. "Julian," she said, "yes. When this is over the assembly, Ashby, all of it, what happens?" He was very still. "What do you want to happen?" he said carefully. She looked at him, at this man who had walked through the rain to her door, who had sat on a too small bench watching children learn the alphabet, who had said we like it was a decision and not an accident. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I know I want to make the decision myself. Not because circumstances pushed me. Not because it was convenient or sensible, or because you have 12 horses and 3,000 acres. She met his eyes. "Because I chose it." Julian looked at her, and what was on his face was something that moved through her like the best kind of ache, not painful, but undeniable. "That is the only way I would want it," he said. She nodded. Picked up the letter from Lady Forsyth from the arm of the chair. "I have to write a response," she said. "What will you say?" "That I look forward to meeting her," she said, "and that I'll be in the 3rd row from the door, wearing my best dress. The one my mother finally returned." Something moved in his face. Almost a smile. The real one. She was starting to be able to recognize it. The way it arrived a beat before it was supposed to. The way it lived around his eyes before his mouth caught up. She left the library. She went upstairs and she sat at her desk, and she wrote to Lady Forsyth. And then she wrote 3 more pages of the school proposal. And then she sat and looked at her hands for a while in the last of the afternoon light. The assembly was in 4 days. Cordelia would be there. Ashby might be there. Lady Forsyth would be there. Half of Hampshire would be there, and the other half would hear about it the next morning. And Eliza Hartwell, who had spent 24 years standing at the edges of rooms and making herself easy to overlook, was going to walk through those doors and stand in the middle. Not because a duke was at her side, because she had decided to. That decision she discovered as she made it, as she felt it settle into her chest with the particular weight of something true, was the most powerful thing she had ever done. She didn't know yet that it was also what was going to save everything. She didn't know that the morning of the assembly would begin with a knock on her door before dawn, and Thomas's face in the gap, and words that would make the floor drop out from under everything she'd built over the past week. She didn't know that Ashby had made his move, and this time he hadn't aimed it at the Duke. He'd aimed it at her. The knock came at 4 in the morning. Eliza was already half awake. She'd been sleeping badly all week, the kind of sleep that sits on the surface and never quite takes hold, and she heard Thomas's footsteps in the hallway before his knuckles touched the door. She knew from the pace of them that something was wrong. Thomas moved at one speed for ordinary things and another speed for everything else, and this was the other speed. She opened the door before he finished knocking. His face told her before his mouth did. "There are men outside," he said, "from Ashby. 3 of them with a magistrate's officer." "They have a writ, Miss Hartwell." He paused. The pause was the worst part. Thomas never paused. "For your father's arrest." She didn't move for a full second. "Then wake his grace now." Thomas went. She dressed in 2 minutes, which was a record, and she was on the stairs before Julian reached the top of them, coming from the other direction, still pulling his coat on, his hair unbrushed, looking more awake than any man had a right to be at 4 in the morning. "How?" she said. "Ashby filed a criminal complaint," Julian said. He was already moving past her toward the front hallway, his voice low and rapid. "Not a civil matter, criminal. Fraudulent misrepresentation in the original lease agreements. He's claiming your father deliberately misled him about the value of the eastern fields when they negotiated the loan." "That's backwards," Eliza said, keeping pace with him. "Ashby misled my father. That's what Greer did. I know that." "You know that. The magistrate's officer at the door doesn't know that at 4 in the morning with a signed writ in his hand." He stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned to look at her. His eyes were fully focused, and she saw in them the thing she'd come to rely on without realizing it, that absolute, unshakable quality of attention. "I need 10 minutes. The officer won't wait 10 minutes. "He will if you ask him to," Julian said. "Go to the door. Don't invite them in. Be polite and be immovable. Tell them your father's solicitor is being contacted. Don't mention me by name." "Why not?" "Because Ashby is counting on me to throw my title at this immediately," he said. "The moment I do, he files an objection, claiming improper interference by a party with a financial interest in the outcome, and it drags into court for 6 months while your father sits in a holding cell." He held her gaze. "Trust me." She looked at him for half a second. 10 minutes, she said. She went to the door. There were 3 of them, 2 men who were obviously Ashby's people, and 1 officer of the magistrate's court who looked exactly like what he was, a man doing an unpleasant job at an unreasonable hour and wishing he was anywhere else. He was holding the writ with the particular careful grip of someone who understands it's the only authority in the situation and doesn't want to lose it. "Good morning," Eliza said. She stood in the doorway in her plain morning dress with her hair half pinned and her voice entirely level. "I understand you have documents." "Miss Hartwell," the officer said, with the reflexive courtesy of a man who was raised right even if the situation wasn't. "I have a writ for the arrest of Edmund George Hartwell on charges of—" "I can see what it says," she said pleasantly. "Our solicitor is being contacted. I'd ask for your patience for a short while." She looked at him directly. "My father is not a flight risk. He is 61 years old and has lived in this house for 30 years. He is not going anywhere. Surely the interests of justice are not so urgent that they cannot accommodate 15 minutes of professional consultation." The officer looked at the writ, looked at Eliza, looked at Ashby's men who were not making eye contact with anyone. 15 minutes, he said. "Thank you," she said. And she almost closed the door. Then she stopped. "Is there somewhere warm you'd rather wait? It's February." The officer blinked. "The kitchen is this way," she said. "Mrs. Poole will have the range lit. There's no reason any of you should stand in the cold." She showed all 3 of them to the kitchen and had Mrs. Poole, who had appeared, as she always did during crises, already dressed and already competent, put the kettle on. Then she went back through the house at a pace, just below running. She found Julian in her father's study. He had papers spread across the desk and a pen in his hand, and was writing with the concentrated speed of a man who has done this before, who knows exactly what words go where and in what order. "What are you doing?" she said. "Counter-affidavit," he said without looking up. Sworn statement from the estate's records showing that the fraudulent misrepresentation, if any occurred, originated with Greer on Ashby's behalf. Signed by me with my title and standing, and witnessed by he looked up. "Can you write legibly?" "Yes, then you're the witness." He pushed a second sheet toward her. "Sign here, date it, and write your full name, not initials." She took the pen. Her hand was steady. She'd always had steady hands. It was one of the things about herself she'd never had to work at. She signed. "This buys time," Julian said, blotting the ink. "It's not a resolution. The officer will take both documents to the magistrate this morning. The magistrate will have to review before proceeding. That gives us until when? Probably tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning." He folded the papers. "The assembly is this afternoon." She stared at him. "You want us to go to the assembly while my father is facing arrest?" "I want you to go to the assembly," he said, "because if you don't show up, Cordelia wins. The narrative wins. Everything you said you wanted to stand for your own voice, your own ground that disappears the moment you hide in this house because Ashby made a move." She thought about it. 3 seconds of hard, honest thinking. "My father," she said. "Your father," Julian said, "is going to spend this morning with my solicitor, who arrived an hour ago. I sent for him 3 days ago when I saw this coming, and who will be filing the counter-affidavit with the magistrate personally. Your father will not be arrested today, I give you my word." She looked at him. "You saw this coming 3 days ago." "I saw Ashby was capable of it," he said. "There's a difference." I hoped he wouldn't. He did. He stood, gathered the papers. "Go get your best dress on. We have an assembly to attend." She went. She dressed carefully for the first time in years. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, not exactly, but because there was something in the deliberateness of it that settled her. The dress was emerald green, her best, the one her mother had finally returned, and that fit the way good things fit when they've been made for you, rather than the person you're pretending to be. She pinned her hair herself, simply without fuss. She put on the only piece of jewelry she actually liked, a small pearl earring that had been her grandmother's. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked, she thought, like herself. That was enough. Beatrice knocked and came in and stopped when she saw Eliza. "Oh," she said. It was a small sound, but it had something in it Eliza had never heard from her mother before. Something uncomplicated, something close to pride. "Don't," Eliza said gently. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were." Beatrice pressed her lips together. "Then you look like your grandmother." Eliza turned back to the mirror. Her grandmother, who had built the household from nothing, who had taught herself to read at 40 because she decided she should know how, who had left Eliza the pearl earrings and a handwritten note that said only, "Be more than they expect." "Good," Eliza said. They went downstairs together. Edmund was in the front hall, looking like a man who had aged 10 years overnight but was choosing to stand up in it. He saw Eliza, and something crossed his face, that look again, the one she'd been seeing more frequently since breakfast 3 days ago. The look of a man who was starting to see his daughter clearly and was doing the complicated accounting of what that meant. "You look wonderful," he said. It came out plain and honest, without performance. "Thank you, Father," she said, equally plain. Julian was waiting by the door. He dressed with the quiet, effortless propriety of a man who has worn good clothes all his life without noticing them. Dark coat, white cravat, everything correct without being showy. He looked at Eliza when she came down the stairs, and he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His face said it, he said. "Yes," she said. They went. The assembly hall was full by the time they arrived, which was the point. Eliza had timed it deliberately, because walking into a half-empty room meant people watched you come in and then went back to their conversations. And she needed people to see her arrive without making the arrival the only thing they remembered. But the room had known she was coming before she walked through the door. She could feel it from the step, the slight, collective adjustment of attention, the way conversations faltered and restarted at lower volumes, the way eyes moved and then moved away and then moved back. She walked in. She walked in the way her grandmother had taught her, which was also the way she'd learned without being taught, not with aggression, not with performance, but with the simple, physical certainty of a person who has decided they belong where they are standing. Julian was a step behind her, not beside her behind, which was her choice, and he'd understood it without being asked. This was her entrance, not theirs, the room recalibrated. She saw it happen. Saw the moment people who had been told one story were confronted with a different one in real time, not a rebuttal, not a defense, just a woman in a green dress walking into a room like she had every right to be there, which she did. The first person to reach her was not who she expected. It was Mrs. Alderton, the vicar's wife, who had 3 children in the village school, and who grabbed Eliza's hands with both of hers and said, loudly enough for the 12 people nearest them to hear clearly, "My James read me a full chapter of scripture last Sunday. On his own, His Grace the Duke tells me it's your doing." She shook Eliza's hands. "I don't care what anyone is saying. James read a full chapter." Eliza felt something crack open in her chest and quickly put it back together. "He worked very hard," she said. "He's remarkable." "He is," Mrs. Alderton said, with the fierce, unwavering certainty of a mother who has been waiting for someone to notice. "And so are you." She moved away. 2 more families came after her. Then 3. People Eliza had taught their children, or people whose elderly parents she'd visited in winter, or people who had simply seen her in the village over the years and had their own ledger of small evidence that did not match the story going around London. Cordelia saw all of it. Eliza found her across the room, found her the way you find the specific weather system in a crowd, by looking for the stillness at its center. Cordelia was standing with Ashby and 2 women Eliza didn't know, and she was watching the room with the expression of a chess player, watching pieces move in ways she hadn't predicted. Their eyes met across the room. Cordelia's expression didn't change. That was Eliza had learned, when she was most dangerous, when nothing showed. Cordelia excused herself from her group and crossed the room. She moved beautifully. She always moved beautifully. She arrived at Eliza's side with the perfectly calibrated warmth of a woman who has decided to make a show of magnanimity. "Eliza," she said, "how brave of you to come." The word brave landed like a splinter under a nail. "Is it?" Eliza said. "I was just thinking how pleasant the evening is." Mrs. Alderton's James has been reading scripture independently. "Did you hear I did?" Cordelia said. She smiled. "You've done wonderful things with those children. It's genuinely admirable." A pause, just long enough, just precisely long enough. "A woman of your particular situation does well to find meaningful work." "Something to occupy, Lady Cordelia." The voice came from behind Eliza's left shoulder. Eliza did not need to turn to know who it was. She'd been told Lady Forsyth changed the temperature of a room, and she felt the change, the shift in atmospheric pressure, the way people nearby suddenly remembered their posture. She turned. Lady Agatha Forsyth was 81 years old and approximately 5 feet tall, and had the eyes of a woman who had been reading rooms accurately for 6 decades and found them, for the most part, disappointingly legible. She was looking at Cordelia. "Lady Cordelia," she said again. The name in her mouth was a complete sentence. "How interesting that you're here. I'd heard you'd been quite busy this week, writing letters." Cordelia's smile held, barely. "Lady Forsyth, what a pleasure." Lady Forsyth said in the tone of someone who has decided not to perform enthusiasm she doesn't feel. She turned to Eliza. Her eyes were sharp and warm and seeing everything at once. "Miss Hartwell, I've been looking forward to this." She took both of Eliza's hands in hers, and the room watched, because the room was always watching Lady Forsyth. That was simply true, and in that gesture, in that 30-second public act of choosing, Eliza felt the narrative shift. Not break, not reverse, shift. "I've read your school proposal," Lady Forsyth said. Eliza went still. "Your proposal?" "The formal document you sent to the County Education Board last week." She squeezed Eliza's hands. "You didn't know they forwarded it to me. I sit on the advisory panel. Have for 11 years, which is exactly 11 years more than anyone expected, but here we are. She tilted her head. It's an excellent proposal. Detailed evidenced. You wrote it like someone who expects to be taken seriously. I do expect to be taken seriously, Eliza said. Good, Lady Forsyth said. Then you'll be pleased to know I've endorsed it. The silence that radiated outward from that sentence was the particular silence of a room full of people doing rapid social arithmetic. Cordelia's face did something she couldn't control. Just for a moment, just one moment, then she had it back smooth and contained, but Eliza had seen it. She'd seen what was underneath it, fear, not of Eliza specifically. Of what Eliza represented, the specific, inconvenient category of woman who could not be managed by reputation because her reputation was being built in real time, in public, by people who had actually been in the room. Lady Forsyth released Eliza's hands and turned, with the unhurried authority of a woman who knows she controls the pace of every conversation she enters, to Cordelia. I understand, she said pleasantly, that you've been concerned about Miss Hartwell's connections. Her suitability, her intentions, the word intentions was exquisitely placed. I find it's generally true that the women other women feel most compelled to undermine are the ones doing something worth noticing. She smiled, which was a warm and absolutely merciless expression. Something to reflect on. She moved away. Cordelia stood for a moment. And Eliza stood across from her. And they looked at each other. And there were no more weapons arranged between them. No more stories being told at other people's expense. No more careful letters to the right people in London. Just two women in a room, one of whom had spent the week trying to make the other small, and one of whom had simply refused. You won't last, Cordelia said quietly. It wasn't venom, it was almost impossibly honest. The honesty of a woman who believes what she's saying. Women like you without money, without position, without what? Quietly, matching her register exactly. A title, an inheritance, a strategy. She held Cordelia's gaze. I have 20 children who can read things they couldn't read 3 years ago. I have a school proposal endorsed by the County Advisory Board. I have a father who is finally paying attention to his own life. And I have my name. She paused. What I don't have is a story I have to maintain. That's the difference between us. Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. Then she left. She walked away with perfect posture and perfect composure, and Eliza watched her go and felt nothing that resembled triumph. Just the clean, quiet feeling of having said a true thing and let it stand. She turned. Julian was there. He'd been at the edge of it, near enough to reach her if she'd needed it, far enough not to make it his. She saw in his face that he'd heard all of it. You didn't need me, he said. No, she said. I know, he said. And he said it the way a person says something they mean genuinely, not deflated, not performing humility. Just honest, that was the point. She looked at him in the assembly hall, with Hampshire society rearranging itself around them, and Lady Forsyth holding court on the other side of the room, and the smell of candles and cold winter air coming through the high windows. Julian, she said, yes. When I said I wanted to choose, she said. When I said I wanted it to be my decision and not circumstances. I remember, he said. I've made it, she said. He went very still. You have, he said quietly. Yes, she held his gaze. I'm not choosing you because you have 12 horses or 3,000 acres or a title that changes how rooms feel when you walk into them. I'm not choosing you because you saved my family from Ashby, or because Lady Forsyth approves of my proposal, or because any of this week has been convenient or sensible, she breathed. I'm choosing you because you sat on a bench that was too small for you and talked to a boy about whether horses dream. Because you said we when you didn't have to. Because you stood behind me tonight instead of beside me. She stopped. Started again. Because you were the only person in that room who didn't laugh. Julian looked at her, and the thing that was on his face, the thing she'd been trying to name, since the first night, since the cold hallway and the tin of salve, and the fire burning low, she finally had the word for it. Home. He looked at her like she was somewhere he'd been trying to get back to for a long time. Eliza. His voice was low and entirely certain. I walked into your father's house in the rain because I needed to see the truth of a property. And I walked out of it. I've been walking out of it ever since, because I saw the truth of you instead." He paused. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. You know that about me already." "I know," she said. "Then you know I mean this," he said. "I would give up every acre and every title and every horse before I would give up being in the same room as the woman who opens. Nobody else is going to open." He held her gaze. "If you'll have me." She looked at him, at this man who had crossed the county in broken boots and been offered a joke, and hadn't laughed and hadn't left, and hadn't, not once, asked her to be anything other than exactly what she already was. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." It wasn't a grand declaration. It didn't need to be. It was two people in a crowded room making a decision that had been building since a rainy night and a cold doorstep, and a woman who opened the door, because it was the right thing to do. He reached for her hand. She gave it, and the room which had been pretending not to watch watched. Edmund Hartwell was not arrested that day. Julian's solicitor presented the counter-affidavit to the magistrate at 9 in the morning, and the magistrate reviewed it, and reviewed Ashby's original writ, and reviewed the clause in the third agreement, and by noon had determined that the matter required a formal hearing at which both sides would present evidence. Ashby's criminal complaint was suspended pending that hearing. His solicitor advised him privately that the case was weak and getting weaker. Greer, when contacted separately by a King's officer, declined to answer certain questions in ways that answered them very loudly. Ashby left Hampshire 2 weeks later. He did not acquire the Eastern Fields. The new lease on the Eastern Fields was negotiated over 3 weeks by Julian's solicitor, and Edmund's new one, a woman Edmund had hired on Eliza's recommendation, which had made Beatrice raise her eyebrows and Edmund nod without argument. The terms were fair, not punishing, not generous, fair. Edmund signed them and read every word first. Greer was disbarred the following spring. The village school received its county funding in March. Eliza used the first disbursement to hire an assistant teacher, a young woman from the village named Agnes, who had taught herself Latin from a borrowed dictionary and was, in Eliza's estimation, wasted on everything she'd been doing before. William learned to read by February. The first thing he read independently, in front of the whole class, was a passage about horses. Lady Forsyth came to the school opening. She sat in the front row and did not look bored for a single minute, which everyone present understood was the highest possible praise. Cordelia Vane went to London. She married a Viscount 2 years later, a decent man, by all accounts, who didn't know quite what he had and spent most of their marriage finding out. She never wrote another letter like the one she'd sent to Lady Margaret. Whether this was conscience or calculation, no one could say. Beatrice Hartwell learned to be present in a way she hadn't been before. It was imperfect and sometimes awkward, and she occasionally reverted to old instincts, but she learned. She and Eliza had tea together on Wednesday mornings, which was small and unremarkable, and meant more than either of them said about it. Edmund, slowly, at his own imperfect pace, became the father he should have been 20 years earlier. He never made another joke at his daughter's expense. Whether he was afraid to or whether he simply understood better, that too was impossible to say. What Eliza chose to believe was the latter. Julian proposed formally, in the library, which was where all the important things between them had happened, on a Tuesday morning in April when the last of the winter had finally let go. He did it without theater and without ceremony, and with the directness that she had loved about him from the beginning, which was that he said what he meant and nothing else. She said yes, she meant it. She had meant it since the assembly hall, and before that since the northern pasture, and before that since the night she'd handed a stranger a cup of tea, and he'd held it with both hands, like it was the warmest thing he'd touched in years. The wedding was in June, at the church in the village, small and specific and full of people who had actually been there for the parts that mattered. Lady Forsyth sat in the third row and wore a hat that was absurd and magnificent. Mrs. Alderton's James served as a page and read a passage from Psalms without a single stumble. William was there, in a borrowed jacket that was slightly too large, looking at the proceedings with the wide, reverent awe he usually reserved for discussions about horses. Edmund Hartwell walked his daughter down the aisle. He did not make a speech at the reception. He stood to one side and watched Julian look at Eliza across a room full of people, and he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it looked like when a man saw a woman clearly. When he saw her for exactly what she was, not what she could provide, not what she represented, not what role she could fill in the architecture of his ambitions. Just her, all of her. Edmund set down his glass and went to find his wife. Eliza Hartwell became the Duchess of Ravensmere on a June morning, and she wore her grandmother's pearl earrings, and she did not need the title to be who she was. She had been who she was long before any of this. Long before the rainy night and the doorstep, and the man in the worn coat who had looked at her in a room full of laughter and refused, quietly and completely, to laugh. The title was not the arrival. It was simply the world catching up to something that had already been true. She had been valuable before anyone knew her name. She had been worth something before anyone with power decided to say so. She had opened the door herself, not because she was waiting for a reward, not because she knew who was standing on the other side, but because someone was cold, and it was the right thing to do. And that was the thing they had tried to make into a joke. And that was the thing that had never, not for a single moment, been anything less than the truest measure of a person's worth.